Well, very good. Good afternoon,
Get us something
everyone.
to eat. I'm starving.
And thank you all for being here today. It's been quite a while since this body looking at local government fiscal stress has met. And for some of you, this would be your first opportunity to serve on this joint subcommittee. So I'd like to say welcome to our newest members, and I look forward to working with each of you as we continue our efforts to examine and address issues related to local fiscal stress. Today on the agenda, we'll hear from staff of the House Appropriations and Senate Finance and Appropriations Committees, who will provide some brief background information on the subcommittee and the state's recent involvement in local fiscal stress, as well as a look at some state and local economic information, local coronavirus relief fund expenditure data, and a high-level overview of the new federal COVID-19 relief bill funding. This will be followed by remarks given by a group of local government officials representing different areas of the Commonwealth who will share their locality's unique challenges and strategies in dealing with the economic issues created by the pandemic and other continuing issues they may have. That will be followed by a period of open dialogue and discussion with members, questions and answers. I welcome all of our panelists today, those of you who have taken time this afternoon to be a part of this, and for those of you who may be listening to this virtual meeting or looking at it as we enter into this discussion. But before we proceed with the agenda, there are some housekeeping items to attend to, including the election of a new vice chair. As some of you may recall, Delegate Chris Jones had been the vice chair of this, and of course is not continuing in service, so we need to elect a vice chair. Also, I would remind all of the members and our panelists, if you are not speaking, be sure to mute your computer so that if your mate happens to call you to take out the garbage, we won't hear that or anything else that might be going on in the background. So given that, I will ask the staff now to take the roll, please. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Starting out, Senator Hanger.
Here.
Senator Howell.
Here.
Senator Lucas. Senator Norman. I thought I saw him. I'll come back. Senator Sasslaw. Delegate Aird.
Present.
Delegate Heretic.
Here.
Delegate Carr.
Present.
Delegate McQuinn.
Present.
Delegate Tyler. Delegate Tyler.
Present.
Delegate Ware.
I'm here.
And then coming back, Senator Norman, are you here?
Kim, I believe he's muted. So
Okay, yeah, he may be muted, but I do see him online.
Okay.
I think we have a quorum, Mr. Chairman, if you would like to proceed with the election of the vice chair.
Okay, good. It does appear that we have a quorum, so that we will proceed. As I mentioned in the opening remarks there, we do have a vacancy in vice chair. Actually, at some point as we reorganize, it may be appropriate to elect also a new chair, but I will continue at the present time in that capacity. But we would like to fill the opening for the vice chair right now. And ideally, to keep our balance, that would come from the House. So do you all have a nomination for a member from the House that would be willing to fill that vacancy?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yes, Delegate McQuinn. I'd like to nominate Delegate Tyler, Rosalind Tyler.
I'll second that.
Okay. We have a motion. And who gave the second?
Delegate Heretic.
Okay, Delegate. We have a motion properly supported. So I would call on the vote. All those in favor then will signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
it's a vote over an electronic meeting, so I have to call the roll again.
You do? How about if it's unanimous?
I am not an attorney,
Okay.
I was just told by the attorneys at
Go ahead.
DLS that in a Zoom environment, we have to call the roll to make a formal action.
Okay, all right, well, go right ahead. Thank you.
All right, I'll start out with you, Senator Hanger.
Aye.
Senator Howe,
Aye.
Senator Norman. I believe he's still on mute. Delegate Aird,
Aye.
Delegate Carr,
Aye.
Delegate Heretic,
Aye.
Delegate McQuinn,
Aye.
Delegate Tyler,
Aye.
and Delegate Ware.
Aye.
It is unanimous, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, very good. Thank you for being agreeable to serving that capacity, Delegate Tyler. And we will continue now with the agenda. Next agenda item is a staff overview of the joint subcommittee's work up to this point and our charge. Who's going to lead off on that?
That will be me, sir.
All
This is
right.
Adam.
All right, Adam.
And Charles is going to go ahead and share his screen, I think, and go ahead and flip the slides for us. So just give him a moment here to do that. There we go. Fantastic. So Charles, you can just go ahead and flip to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. Okay, so thank you again, Mr. Chairman. So as you indicated in your opening remarks, staff is going to provide a brief presentation with some background information regarding the joint subcommittee and some state and local revenue and economic information, as well as local coronavirus relief fund expenditure data and a high-level look at the new federal COVID-19 relief bill and estimates of Virginia's share of the roughly $186 billion in new funding allocated directly to the states. Then our local government panelists will have an opportunity to provide some insights on their experiences and information they'd like to share with the joint subcommittee, followed by some open dialogue and member Q&A. Next slide, please, Charles. Okay, so now we're just going to move into some background information. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a look at the enabling language, mostly for those of you who haven't been part of the joint subcommittee yet, and frankly, it's been a while since everyone has met. So this was originally included as budget language in Chapter 836 of the 2017 session and was slightly modified in Chapter 2 of the 2018 special session to add under Paragraph 2, which outlines the goals and objectives of the joint subcommittee to, in addition to savings opportunities from increased regional cooperation and consolidation of services, to also consider including by jointly operating or merging small school divisions. And just to quickly highlight these goals and objectives, which include the review of several issues that could potentially alleviate fiscal stress, including savings opportunities from increased regional cooperation and consolidation of services, including by jointly operating or merging small school divisions, local responsibility for service delivery of state mandated or high priority items, causes of fiscal stress among local governments, potential financial incentives and other governmental reforms to encourage increased regional cooperation, and the different taxing authorities of cities and counties. Next slide, please. Okay, so now to provide just some background information on the state's recent involvement in local fiscal stress. If you recall back in 2016, when Petersburg was experiencing some financial difficulties, they requested state assistance, and a finance team led by then Secretary of Finance Brown and others, including consultants from the Robert Bob Group, were deployed. There were subsequent money committee briefings on Petersburg and more broadly the issue of local fiscal stress and what the state might do to proactively address it. This was followed by budget language in 2017 to begin the process of identification, prevention, and intervention if needed for fiscally distressed localities, to include the APA's development of its early warning system, which uses financial metrics reported by localities with the submission of their CAFR to make preliminary determinations of potential fiscal distress. In addition, some initial funding of $500,000 of unspent aid to localities was provided to facilitate technical assistance by the Secretary of Finance for certain intervention and remediation efforts. Also, in the intervening period, 3 meetings of this joint subcommittee took place, examining these issues, with the last being, as the chairman indicated, in 2018, where you heard from the APA as well as the city managers for both Bristol and Petersburg. Then in 2020, bills passed, chapters 1263 and 1214, which made significant changes toward the equalization of local taxing authority between cities and counties, including cigarette taxes, admissions taxes, addressing limitations on transient occupancy taxes, and eliminating the requirement to hold referenda prior to the imposition of the food and beverage tax. In addition, pursuant to the bills, a local tax authority work group was convened to examine any technical amendments to the bills that may be necessary, which released its report in October of last year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll transition into looking at some state and local revenue data and where we've been fiscally speaking over the last several months to help frame the discussion about the acute and potentially longer term effects of our current pandemic-induced economic issues at both the state and local levels, and really examine what differentiates the state from political subdivisions when these sorts of economic crises occur. So at a very high level view for the state prior to the pandemic, general fund revenues were strong. Then, as we all know, the coronavirus made its way to the U.S. and Virginia, and by March necessitated the closure of many what were considered non-essential businesses in order to safeguard the health and safety of Virginians, which resulted, of course, in the loss of tax revenue impacting state and local economies. In April, the administration anticipated that revenues would decline by about $1 billion each year, and FY20 revenues ended up being about $234 million below the forecast, which triggered the statutory revenue reforecast process, and the resulting economic outlook was significantly slower growth than what was assumed in the 2020 regular session budget and the subsequent special session budget, which reduced revenues by about $2.7 billion. So fast forward to the November-December timeframe, both JABE and GACR meet, and that's the Joint Advisory Board of Economists and the Governor's Advisory Council on Revenue Estimates. And they meet and share a slightly more positive outlook with respect to the Virginia's economic posture and better than expected year-to-date revenues in the current fiscal year suggest a gradual, if not tenuous and somewhat uneven economic recovery is underway. Next slide, please. So this is a graph that was recently shared by staff at the Senate Finance and Appropriations annual meeting. It's just an interesting graphical depiction of the FY20 revenue changes relative to forecast and the declines in growth corresponding chronologically with the introduction of the virus and the subsequent public health measures through June. So you can see, of course, the virus entered the U.S. and its health precautions necessitate some business closures. Those actual revenues begin to decline, and then following select business reopenings, they begin to tick back up, closing out at 2% growth, though below the forecasted 3.1% growth. Next slide, please. And now, again, looking at FY21 year-to-date revenues, and this is a slide from the Secretary of Finance's presentation in December to the money committees. So relative to the current budget, you can see that through November, we were relative to the previously forecasted growth of negative 1.8%. So again, from a high level look from the state perspective, while there's some reason for relative tempered optimism with respect to the state's economic picture, you know, what does this mean for localities exactly? Next slide, please. Great. So this is a look at the primary sources of local own source revenue for cities, counties, and towns. So you can see that for the most part, they're universally pretty reliant on property taxes, particularly real property tax collections, which have typically lagged overall statewide growth in a post-recessionary environment, but are also maybe a little less likely to acutely decline during an economic downturn. So generally inelastic compared to some of the state's primary sources of revenue, such as individual income taxes, which represent about 68% of total state general fund revenue. And looking at those sources, with the current economic situation, you can see that in the immediate term, there are likely revenue sources that might be disproportionately impacted at the local level, such as your occupancy taxes, meals taxes, and BPOL revenues. So really your brick and mortar business and service delivery categories, traveling and so forth, which may have a direct and immediate impact on those sources. And then look into the medium and long term, what impact might it have on commercial real estate, not only due to business closures, but also maybe the demand for commercial property, potentially declining due to changes in business telecommuting policies, and that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So this slide shows that there's actually a historical precedent for an uneven recovery between the state and counties and cities in terms of recovering losses in the downturn. So this depicts revenue growth from 2009 through 2020, and you can see that for cities and counties, it took a year to get back to revenue levels they were seeing prior to the Great Recession. Now, having said that, the circumstances and resulting economic crisis that resulted from the Great Recession are quite different from the economic distress that's being caused by the pandemic for a number of different reasons. So following the conclusion of this presentation, our staff, our panelists rather, will be able to provide some details about what they have and are currently experiencing at the local level and how they've uniquely addressed any revenue related and budgetary concerns based on what made sense for them in their communities, and how those issues may or may not have been mitigated through state and local programs and the utilization of federal relief funds. So now, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to go ahead, and if there are no questions on that portion of the presentation, and we may want to just proceed, my colleague Kim McKay is going to go ahead and take over the presenting duties and discuss the local coronavirus relief fund expenditures at the local level, and then provide a glance at the new federal COVID relief bill and Virginia's estimated direct allocation.
Okay, Adam, before we proceed into that, let's just see if there are any questions on the numbers that you shared there.
Yes, sir.
One area that kind of stood out to me, well, that wasn't presented, I guess, and it's hard to get a handle on exactly what's fair and what isn't, but the state contribution to, as far as the mix for the various localities. And I guess we'll have other slides, or maybe not in this presentation, at a later time, where we've developed the fiscal stress barometers that we have been looking at and trying to refine. Because at some point, I guess in our work, we're really going to need to figure out how to better allocate state funds to deal with the various situations that are causing the fiscal stress. Obviously, the composite index is one. Our funding or lack of funding for 599 funding, there are a whole multitude. And it would seem that the legislation that we passed last year will help counties with their, it looked like from the slide, over-reliance on real and personal property. They'll be able to expand their tax base some. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes over the next couple of years. Are there other questions? I see, Steve, Steve, I believe you're muted. Oh, Janet, Senator Howe?
I was just going to request that we be sent this presentation. It was a bit meaty for me to absorb all at once like that.
Okay.
Yes, we'll set that out, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, other questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman, this is Delegate Ware.
Yes, Delegate Ware.
Thank you, sir. Looking at the slide on number 10, you have a listing of local source tax revenues, and clearly the second largest is a miscellaneous category. Can you give us a sense what all other refers to? Are there predominant or common elements there?
Mr. Chairman, Delegate Ware, I'll actually, I'm not entirely sure what comprises the all other there. I could bring up a CAFR, but that probably is not the most efficient way to do that. I would ask that if one of our, during the remarks or during the dialogue portion of the meeting, if one of the local government representatives might be able to best answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's fine. And I just, for our purposes going ahead, would be interested to know.
Yeah, and I think where if when we're provided these slides, if we can readily see or have some information to kind of expand that out, the all other, into several other categories, that might be helpful to see as well.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Other questions or comments at this time? Okay, I don't hear any more. So Adam, you want to pass the baton?
Yes, sir. So
All
Charles.
right.
Advance.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can start with slide 12. As many of you know, the coronavirus relief funds, or CRF, were a component or are a component of the Federal CARES Act. Virginia received $3.1 billion in CRF support that could be used to help states and locality respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. The state retained about $1.8 billion of these funds, and distributed 1.3 billion to localities in 2 rounds of funding. Fairfax, due to its size, received about $200 million in direct CRF support from the federal government. Now, the CARES Act did include some limitations around the use of these funds. They could not be used to backfill revenue lost. They could only be used to help respond to the pandemic. They could not be included in any budget prior to March 27th or the signature of the CARES Act. And the expenditures needed to have occurred during the March 27th and December 31st of last year. Next slide. In distributing the CRF funds to localities, the state used a formulaic-based approach, and that was based on population. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, this occurred in 2 rounds of funding in FY20 and FY21. And localities, in order to receive funds, were required by the Department of Planning and Budget to certify they would only use funds in accordance with the provisions of the Federal CARES Act. We can move to the next slide. With that background in mind, we can start to look at some data on the local share of CRF money and expenditures to date. Now, this data, I will qualify it, is from the Department of Accounts, reported by localities, and it's as September 30th, 2020. As you can see, as of that date, localities have spent just about 37% or $480 million of their CRF money. Now, in that same report that Adam and I received from the Department of Accounts, localities reported obligating funding to programs, services, and other uses in that same report, with about 22% of funds remaining unobligated. Next slide. This is just a chart that shows CRF spending as of September 30th, 2020 by locality. The localities in the lighter shade of blue have spent more of their CRF money. So as you can see on this chart, Henrico County and Manassas City have spent 100% of their CRF funds they were awarded through the CARES Act. And the darkest shades on this map, those counties have a majority of their funds remaining. So Lee County, for example, at the bottom part of the state, had just about 99.9% of their funds remaining as of this report date. Next slide. So this chart, it's a little intense. It can be absorbed in multiple tranches, but really the bottom line at the end of the day is, in terms of local CRF expenditures from that report, you can see in the teal on this chart that 80% of local CRF expenditures were in 5 main areas. 30% went towards payroll for public health and safety employees. Another 16% to support distance learning efforts at K through 12 schools. Another 15% was used for personnel and services that were dedicated to a different use in responding to the pandemic. So these are people that were already in the budget, but since they were put towards different work during the pandemic and responding to it, it was an eligible CRF expense. About 13% went to help small businesses. And then the other 6% were in program services or expenses not captured in the survey by the Department of Accounts. Next slide. So that kind of gives you an overview of the CRF money through the CARES Act. And then these next couple slides transition to the 4th COVID stimulus relief package and tell you a little bit about what we know right now. As you know, Congress passed the 4th COVID stimulus package in late December. 2/3 of the funding in that total package went to 3 areas.
Yeah, where is it?
Aid to small businesses, and that includes $285 million in PPP loans for small businesses. and then an additional direct stimulus checks, and then the federal extension of supplemental UI programs. So that includes an additional $300 a week in supplements for benefits, extended the amount of time you can receive extended benefits, and then as additional support for the federal unemployment programs that support gig workers and self-employed individuals. Next slide. So these are early numbers in terms of what Virginia can expect to see in its share of COVID-19 relief funding through the fourth federal stimulus package. They're early numbers from a national source, but we can anticipate $2.7 billion in funding that will flow to states and localities. The state can expect more funds flowing to the state through things like I mentioned earlier on the previous slide, like small business program assistance, federal UI programs, and then the direct stimulus check. A majority of the funds Virginia can anticipate for would be for education stabilization at K through 12 and higher education, testing and vaccines, and then finally a large rental assistance program. Next slide. This final slide is just another way to look at the share of funding coming to the state and localities. Again, these estimates are from a national organization, so I know the Money Committee staff are really working to understand and refine these numbers with state agencies. The K through 12 funds, as you can see, are a large share of what we can expect to receive in the state. Then these can go to flexible uses like Title I expenses, PPE, technology for remote learning, and HVAC improvements. The key that we found out so far with these funds is about 90% will go directly towards school divisions. So about $840 million, which is 3 times the amount school divisions received through the Elementary Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund and the CARES Act. Additionally, the rental assistance program has provisions that localities with populations of over 200,000 individuals can receive direct rental assistance funds to support those programs. So we anticipate about 45% or $256 million could be used of the total tranche for Virginia to go directly towards localities to support these needs. And then the last thing I will say, tying it all together about fourth COVID-4 stimulus package and the CRF money in the CARES Act, the COVID-4 package did extend the use of the CRF funds to the end of this calendar year. So localities who have not spent their funds to date will be able to use those funds with recovery efforts and relief efforts throughout this calendar year. With that, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions, we can move into the panel discussion on our agenda.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. Let's, are there questions any member has?
Mr. Chair, and Delegate McQuinn,
Yes.
I do have a question, and I think, yes, I have a question.
Go right ahead.
And I'm sort of forgot what page it was on, but however, the localities that was able to spend 100% of the revenues that they received, is there any number as to how much they were able to spend, and how does it compare their 100% like spending those funds compared to other localities?
Yes, Delegate McQuinn, the answer to your question is actually in the appendix of our presentation.
Okay.
I don't know if we want to flip back there to show her where she can find that answer, and I'm happy to talk with you more.
Okay, we can talk offline. Now, have we sent, is the document sent to all of us? Because I was just going to get them printed off, was going to print them off if it is.
It's been sent this morning, but we will resend it out at the end of this meeting. And
okay, excellent.
Also uploaded it to our House Appropriations Committee website for you. But
excellent.
I do have
Thank-
an answer to your question, and it's in a very detailed chart at the end of the presentation.
Okay, don't worry. I'll get it later. Thank you.
Hey, Kim and Mr. Chairman and Delegate McQuinn, I tell you that we actually have one of our panelists is the Director of Finance for Henrico County, and they were one of the 2 localities that actually expended 100% of their funds. So they'll
Excellent.
be intimately familiar with how much money they had and how they expended those funds. Of course, if you want to see it in relation to other localities from a total fund standpoint, you can.
Yes. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Other questions? And I expect, since these numbers we're looking at were dated back in the end of September, I think all of the localities were, just as the state, were scrambling to spend it all so that it would not be taken back. So
Yes.
it'll be interesting to see when the dust settles what those numbers are in there. Other questions right now? Del McQuinn, did you have a follow-up? I'm sorry.
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, one additional question: when we talk about the 2.7 billion that's coming to Virginia, is that inclusive of the direct stimulus payments that are going out to individuals?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself quickly enough, Mr. Chairman. That does not include those direct stimulus payment. It doesn't include things like supplemental UI or the small business assistance that would be flowing into the state. That's just reflective of what we can get in terms of programs that will support the state and be administered by the state and localities.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Kimberly. Now, how are we going to handle does that complete the staff overview?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that completes the staff overview. And if you wanted to just reference the agenda, we could just go, in terms of the roundtable discussion, we could just go in order of the agenda.
Okay.
And
All right.
so that would be.
We'll then just call on individually the members as the individual representatives in the localities as listed on the agenda, if that works for you all. And we will begin then with, do we have Megan Coates from Henrico County online?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon,
Well,
Mr. Hanger. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Before I jump in to just give you an overview of Henrico County's approach in reaction to COVID, a couple of questions that you asked regarding the makeup of local revenues. State revenue, state aid to the localities is about 35% of Henrico's general fund. So it does make up a substantial portion for us. And as I look at that category of other local taxes, that would include things like recordation taxes, consumer utility taxes, motor vehicle license taxes, bank franchise taxes, and then also other permits, fees, and licenses, I would suppose. So I was asked to give you just about a 5-minute overview of Henrico over the past year or so. When COVID first hit in March, we had just released our fiscal 21 budget. About 7 or 8 days later, Virginia had its first case and our board went back to the drawing board. We cut $100 million from the fiscal 21 budget as our reaction to the coronavirus. Our approach was to find a floor. We wanted to be as aggressive as we could possibly be so that should the virus persist as it has, that our budget would be low enough that we could sustain it for the duration of the fiscal year and not have to come back and make additional cuts. So that is the approach we took. As we have navigated this fiscal year, our residential real estate and our personal property is generally still performing pretty well. And as you saw, that is the bulk of our local revenues. Where we have felt quite a bit of pain is in our consumer and our elastic revenues. They took substantial hits in the spring and they have bounced back a little bit over the summer and fall, but they still substantially lag the prior year. Some examples of those would be meals taxes, still down 10 to 20%. Occupancy taxes here, still down 25 to 30%. And then some of our increased expenses that we've seen are significant overtime in our public safety agencies, Amongst all of our other employees, we've had significant use of emergency leave for quarantine and taking care of children. PPE has been an incredible expense for us. We've spent more than $20 million on PPE for our public safety team and our school division. And then technology obviously is something that we had to invest heavily in upfront. As noted, we were one of the localities who expended all of our CARES Act funding by September 30th. We did that. We had a very intentional approach to the CARES Act funding because the guidance was so unclear and because it was ever changing. What we did was take the most broadly applicable guideline that we could to help meet our expenditures. The easiest one was the $500 allotment per student per pupil. That did not require documentation. And so we allocated our first $25 million towards our public schools. After that, the balance of our funding went to fire and EMS for salaries, and then to our sheriff's department. And we had a significant outbreak in our jail early on in the spring. We also had a plan B so that should we have a federal audit or should our local external auditor take issue with our approach to application of the rules, we also documented specific time and salaries for time spent away from people's typical job, also documented every cost for goods and services, and we have just surpassed what was our total allocation. So we've spent our funding multiple ways and did that so that we could protect ourselves against any potential future audit. One thing that made it most challenging for us was the lack of revenue replacement language. For us, we had to put a number of very important programs and services specifically related to recovery and the opioid epidemic had to be put on hold for us. And that's something that we could have continued if we had that revenue replacement language. Overall, while we're still underperforming, we do feel like we're relatively stable. I have a couple of concerns as we move forward into the future. A lot of our commercial leases have not yet expired. And so we are assuming that over the next 12 to 24 months, as leases expire and companies move to more permanent telework, we could see lower occupancy rates in our office environments, would result in lower assessments. Our meals, occupancy, and sales taxes are largely driven by people's attitudes towards travel. And you might know that Central Virginia had really prided itself on becoming a destination, specifically for sports tourism. And so for us, whether that market picks back up again is really going to drive a lot of the future. And then the last concern that we have is about the Fed. Likely in 2022 is when they suggest they might raise benchmark rates again. We think that could create some pressures in residential real estate. Current home prices, which are steadily increasing, have been accommodated by lower mortgage rates being offered. And once those rates start to rise, we do feel like there could potentially be an issue in housing affordability. And so I'll just wrap it up with a couple of plugs for how you all could help us as a local government. The hold harmless language regarding state aid for education is critical for Henrico. Our enrollment's down about 1,500 students. Our neighbors to the south in Chesterfield down about 3,000 as I understand it. If you ran those numbers through the SAQ formula, it could be devastating for us. And so without understanding how long it might take families to feel comfortable returning their children to public education, we would ask for that hold harmless language for multiple years into the future. As I noted, Central Virginia was a destination for sports tourism, and so additional funding for marketing when appropriate to help get traffic back through the Richmond airport. And then finally, reallocation of the recordation taxes that were redirected to Hampton Roads a couple years ago. That cost Henrico County about $1.5 million a year, and would be critical for us as we start to emerge from this recession. And so that's the remarks that I had prepared. I'm happy to take questions now or turn it over to the next person and answer any questions you have later.
Okay, well, thank you, Megan. I think what we'll do is go ahead and allow the other three panelists to make their presentations, if you can hang around, and then we'll get into a little bit of dialogue with questions at that time. Next on our schedule, we have the chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, Jeff McKay. Jeff, are you on?
I am on, Senator. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you very much. Senator Hanger, good to see you again. And I appreciate your work in particular with the Virginia Association of Counties and your work on this subcommittee. Appreciate being invited today. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Jeff McKay, and I'm chairman of the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors. But I'm most pleased this year to serve as president of the Virginia Association of Counties. So I'm providing some comments today from both the local and statewide perspectives and what we're hearing from our member jurisdictions across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I appreciate the comments that Ms. Coates made earlier. I think you'll hear some similarities from my comments. First, I want to start by thanking you again for establishing this joint subcommittee. We know you have many complicated issues to consider as legislators, and we're grateful to you for focusing on the challenges that we also face at the local level, as we are faced with many of the most difficult challenges any of us have ever experienced in public office, as well as future opportunities we have to strengthen our state and local partnership to improve services that we provide to our shared constituents. We all represent the same folks. And I want to thank you, as was mentioned earlier, for the additional revenue options that counties achieved with the General Assembly last session. I know some of the folks from the General Assembly on this subcommittee played a big role in making sure we had that flexibility. These additional tools will be very important for diversification of county revenues and mitigating counties' historic reliance on property taxes. And I'll just emphasize for a moment to answer the same question that Ms. Coates answered a minute ago, that miscellaneous category is going to be different locality by locality. But in Fairfax, that's made up of just about 1% federal funding, 0.3% fines, 1.9% charges for services the county provides, 1.1% for permits and licenses, and 0.5% revenue from use of our property rental fees, and a small percent of revenue for return on investments that we have for things like our retirement system. And our percent revenue from the Commonwealth in Fairfax, when you take out schools, is 2.3% of our overall budget. And so I think you can kind of see by that the differences that different counties have in the way those percentages work. Although in Fairfax County, we've been really fortunate to control some of our losses during this pandemic in particular. I know that other localities won't be as lucky. For now, in FY 2022, we estimate a shortfall of over $40 million in Fairfax County, with expected revenues projected to be flat, with zero growth expected in combined real estate and property taxes, probably for the foreseeable future, especially with the downturn in the commercial side of that. That said, as we recover from the pandemic, we expect that these additional tax options that you've approved will provide critical local flexibility in the future in raising revenues to meet local needs. And I think it's pretty obvious as we sit here today that we all realize how difficult it might be for some counties to take advantage of some of those additional revenue sources during the pandemic. And just to use an example of that here locally, we're very grateful for the opportunity for the first time ever to impose a meals tax. But obviously right now we're struggling to even understand how many of our restaurants will be able to survive this pandemic and still have their doors open. And so the timing is difficult, but we know long-term that's still the right decision. Our needs locally are growing ever more complex. Even before the pandemic, local governments have been supporting our school divisions in educating increasing numbers of economically disadvantaged children and children with special needs. We're grappling with the effects of the opioid epidemic, and we're serving increasing numbers of children with histories of trauma in our local CSA, Children's Services Act program. Of course, the pandemic has put an unprecedented strain on local governments, and the need for our local communities have grown substantially in this last year. Federal resources, especially the CARES Act, have been vital in aiding localities with the costs of our pandemic response. And as was mentioned in your presentation earlier, Fairfax County was large enough to qualify for a direct distribution of CARES Act funding directly from the federal treasury, all of which has been allocated here locally in Fairfax. But on behalf of VACO, I want to express our appreciation for the state's allocation of these dollars to all of the other counties and cities in Virginia. Localities, as you know, have used these funds to procure essential public health supplies, improve broadband access, assist struggling residents with food and housing needs, support local small businesses, among other critical local needs. In Fairfax, our CRF dollars went directly back into the community. We've allocated $33 million to our local nonprofits to support basic needs, $52 million towards a grant program for micro and small businesses, and $19.6 million to further assist our public school system with their work to reopen. These funds were also crucial in continuing to support county operations, make sure that our county buildings and services remained open every day of the pandemic to serve our residents. To name a few administrative uses, we put $17.2 million towards providing 6 weeks of pandemic administrative leave to our employees. $10 million is going to go towards hazard pay for first responders, and $13.5 million were required to meet all of our increased IT and teleworking needs to, again, make sure that we maintained county government and continued to serve our community. These essential as these federal funds have been to our response and recovery, a strong state and local partnership will remain the cornerstone of our ability to provide the services that Virginians depend on and expect. And we appreciate the efforts of the legislature and the governor have made to shield aid to local governments and the revisions to the biennium budget during 2020. And we're especially grateful for the steps that have been taken to protect school divisions from revenue losses due to sales tax reductions and fluctuations in enrollment. And I want to underscore that, as you heard that from Ms. Coates a minute ago, that is going to be absolutely critical, not only to our budgets, but also to help our schools be able to reopen. As we move towards economic recovery, we want to look for opportunities to strengthen our state and local relationship. We believe that close collaboration and increased support from the Commonwealth in the following areas will begin to relieve some financial stress and responsibility for localities. I just want to cover a couple of these very quickly. One is the intersection of behavioral health and the criminal justice system. Diverting individuals with behavioral health needs from the criminal justice system whenever possible has been a major initiative of ours in Fairfax County. And we know that many of our sister jurisdictions have undertaken similar efforts across Virginia. We want to work in partnership with the state on successful implementation of the new Marcus Alert system. And similarly, localities will need help from the state in meeting the proposed standards for behavioral health care in jails that were directed by the 2019 General Assembly. Our funding formulas for Commonwealth's attorneys absolutely need to be looked at. Funding formula right now rewards folks for incarcerating individuals instead of rewarding jurisdictions for helping treat some of the challenges that our folks in our court system face. And programs like the one we have for Diversion First have potential to save the Commonwealth tremendous amounts of money. And we should be rewarding those types of programs instead of rewarding jurisdictions for incarcerating people. In general, as the state examines its criminal justice, resources to enable each aspect of our system to fulfill its function are increasingly critical now. Funding for full staffing for law enforcement, circuit court clerks, magistrates, Commonwealth's attorneys, public defenders, district court employees, and probation office employees ensures that localities are not placed in a difficult position of needing to continually supplement these offices with limited local dollars. Next area is on elections. Last year, of course, represented a historic expansion of opportunities for Virginians to vote. And we know there continues to be an interest in improving our election system by the General Assembly. Localities, as you know, invest significant funds in the administration of elections. And we would encourage the state to provide additional support for this vital function to make sure that equity continues to be a cornerstone of how we conduct our elections. And then lastly, school capital needs. In 2013, it was reported that more than 40% of the state's public school buildings and facilities were built at least 50 years ago, and another 20% were constructed at least 40 years ago. Several jurisdictions have pursued additional local option sales tax authority to address their construction and renovation needs, and we support, especially on behalf of VACO, extending this authority to all localities. We also believe the state could play a complementary role in assisting with these efforts. And so in closing, Senator, on behalf of both VACO and Fairfax County, we thank you for your efforts to support local governments, and we stand ready to work with you as always, and look forward to the discussion today and answering any questions that anybody might have. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Jeff. And if you can stay a few minutes, then we will defer questions until the other two panelists have spoken. Thank you.
Absolutely.
We appreciate it. Our next panelist is from York County, the county administrator there, Jeff Morgan. Jeff, are you online?
Oh, actually, my name is Neil, but I'm here.
Oh, Neil, I'm sorry, Neil. Yes. I'm sorry.
Good afternoon. I didn't hear anything that the first two panelists said that I would take exception to. And so I'm going to try to modulate my remarks to focus on a few things that are a little bit different, so you won't hear the same thing repeated. The first thing I'd like to say, going back to one of the delegates' questions about the other revenue sources. For us, the state revenue is about 8%, percentage-wise, somewhere between the other two examples. One that's been really interesting this year that we've noticed is a lot of small user fees. For example, people going to court and people signing up for parks and rec programs. We're really getting hurt on those small types of user fees because a lot of those things just aren't occurring, as they normally do. And one other category that I didn't hear the others mention is public service corporations. If you have a utility with significant taxable property in your community, that for us is about 2.5% of our general fund. So just to answer that question. Overall, I would say, pivoting to the main topic, that it's my sense that most of your local governments have done reasonably well during this very bizarre and unprecedented time. I think we've made mistakes, financial and programmatically, at all levels of government. We continue to learn as we go along. For us in York County, and probably for just about everybody, uncertainty about what's going to happen next has been our biggest challenge. Local revenues, what's going on with the state budget, what are the feds going to do, what's the newest health executive order going to do, economically. All of those things have just whipsawed us at every level over the last few months. So regarding the CARES Act funds, I just want to be real clear, even though the continually changing rules have been really aggravating, and finding out that we have another year now that we've basically all had to figure out what we were going to do with the money and spend it before we found that out, it has made a huge difference for local government. And the fact that it overlapped 2 different fiscal years has really given us a buffer, because it allowed us essentially to support how the year ended in FY20, and it allows us to anticipate being able to get through some challenges in FY21. So that overlapping fiscal year situation has been the key. And for us and many, if you had updated data about how the CARES Act funding was going to be committed, I think you'll see that for many, reimbursing ourselves for a portion of our public safety payroll, that's been the big saving grace of this program. I don't think most of us could have figured out how to buy enough computers and enough PPE to spend all of that money. And the reimbursing public safety payroll has really allowed us to buffer our budgets over 2 fiscal years. So in terms of the York County story about how we responded to the pandemic, basically what we did was we responded with muscle memory to what had happened during the Great Recession. And after having releasing a budget recommendation, I remember in early March, the day I was presenting the budget, right about the time the emergency was declared, thinking that everything I was saying wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And in about 3.5 weeks, we totally revised our budget and essentially reduced all expenditures and corresponding revenue estimates by about 5%. We froze our capital budget for a year, except for a small amount of emergency funds for both the schools and the county. And then we, stumbled forward with all the uncertainty that we've all experienced. Now, what's happened since then is somewhat positive, as you've heard from the others. It's almost been a tale of 2 counties for us. Anybody affiliated with residential real estate's doing well, at least in the short term. Sales tax has held up surprisingly well. I'll just say, thank God for the decision that allowed internet sales tax to be collected and distributed, because those trends obviously accelerated very rapidly over the past year. And I think many of us would have been hurt much more seriously had that not occurred. I suspect your staff would conclude that localities that are highly dependent on tourism revenue are suffering a little bit more than some of the others. And for us, even though they're not gigantic revenue sources in terms of percentages, lodging taxes, have been just absolutely devastated at some points during the fiscal year, down by as much as 80%. Meals tax more in the 30 to 40% range. So as we think about next year's budget, much of what we wonder is, how fast are those things going to come back? And again, as has been mentioned by others, we really wonder longer term about our commercial real estate tax base. We have many timeshares, we have many hotels, and some office buildings, all of which, if this goes on too much longer, folks are going to conclude that, based on the rental streams, that their assessments are too high. So, once we get to the next reassessment cycle, even with the internet sales tax holding up, we have hundreds of thousands of square feet of vacant retail space, and the problems with bricks and mortar retail have only accelerated during the pandemic. So what that means in the longer term is unclear. Going to what you all could do to help, as the other speakers indicated, this committee's work to give counties some revenue options that they didn't have before is greatly appreciated and will be very significant over time. My advice, thinking about the state in the short term, is to keep it simple. There's 100 different problems that you could fix, but we all understand that the 2 biggest things we spend money on are public education and public safety. And whatever you can do to support us in those 2 areas makes all of our other challenges much more manageable. And in particular, as the others have said, sort of supporting the public schools with the dip in the average daily membership, and hopefully with some of this new federal money is going to put us in a position where we won't have to consider a tax increase just to support the schools in the upcoming fiscal year. So I thank you very much for all you have done always, and in particular during this tumultuous year.
Thank you, Neil. Appreciate you being with us today. And you could be able to stick around a few more minutes as well. Okay, good. Well, we'll continue to hold our questions. Our final panelist that we have scheduled is David Smitherman from down in Pittsylvania County. David, are you on board?
I am. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to be able to speak with you folks today and provide a slightly maybe different perspective from a largely rural county, in fact, the largest rural county in Virginia. We comprise ourselves of nearly 1,000 square miles and 62,000 inhabitants, very agrarian, and depend largely on the city of Danville for our commerce. So we do have a slightly different perspective of fiscal reality. We have been experiencing a strong real estate market, probably one of the stronger ones that we've seen in a decade, if not two, even back to the late 90s. Things have really picked up. Building permits are up. We're seeing a lot more activity in the just over the past few years, which has continued during the COVID epidemic, is economic development activity from the private sector and the recruitment of businesses. You'd think that would be an immediate stop. The only things that have really slowed down in our economic development world are offshore clients that we are working with. That has absolutely screeched to a halt, but domestic activity has been good for us. And we hope things will bear fruit there. As it relates to the other category or miscellaneous category of our revenue, it is largely also comprised as others of state shared revenue and state aid, overwhelmingly with respect in the general fund to our activities with the compensation board. I'm going to use this opportunity to tell you it's the most antiquated bureaucratic system I've ever seen in my 25 years of local government service. And I find it fascinating that every comp board employee has a name and a number, and their salary is tracked by bureaucrats in Richmond instead of locally. And if there's ever reform, just give us a block grant of those funds and let us administer our people. I think it'd be a lot easier. Fees and permits are the other big portions of the other category. When the pandemic hit, we, like everyone else, froze capital, froze positions, curtailed spending, because we didn't know what was going to happen. Of course, our savior has been the sales tax. And as mentioned previously, the lawsuits to solve the internet sales tax point of delivery scheme of distributing revenue has been a godsend to us. And I'm looking at a chart on my computer right now, the last 18 months of our sales tax revenue. It's very volatile until February of 2020, and then we had a 30% drop over a 60-day period, and then a full recovery where we have stayed without hardly any fluctuation for the remainder of the pandemic to date. Just looking at our historical sales tax revenue, that is the most stable it has been in recent history, and has been the reason that we feel fairly good fiscally right now, in addition to the CRF program. So CRF has been, for us, it has been like a catapulting of all of our plans. We have used it strategically, almost as well as we should, as a local stimulus program. It has employed a lot of people in its advanced county operations, particularly in the public safety sector. We had a very deliberate process to administer and award our $10.6 million of CRF funding that had multiple stages, multiple review processes, and ultimately anything over $100,000 was approved by our Board of Supervisors. We worked with our community college, we worked with our school system, we worked with small businesses to provide aid. And And like I said, we advanced programs that in our wildest imagination we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. And a good example of that is the purchase of quick response vehicles for our overwhelmingly volunteer fire and rescue service. We have almost 24 volunteer fire and rescue agencies in our community that were not well prepared to respond to this pandemic, whether it be with PPE, with ambulances, with supplies, with trucks. We have largely vaulted forward the public safety of our community using these CRF funds, and we're very proud of that. Another thing that we were struggling with was how do we administer the election process during a pandemic? And we were able to shore up our election system, create new spaces to allow for the increased utilization of early voting. And we just, at the strike of midnight at the end of the year, we finished a new election center that is a much more conducive place for this activity during the pandemic, and we're really proud of that. We supported our schools with, as everyone else, with lots of technology, hotspots. We have worked to increase the availability of internet connectivity in our community. We are struggling very badly, as is most of rural Virginia, getting quality access to our students and to our homes. And we're able to modestly help in that regard. Other things like as you know, so many of our buildings are 100 years old or older, and we've been able to upgrade the HVAC systems and get some air cleaning equipment involved, air sanitizers, and that has been well received by both the public and the community. And the final thing we did, speaking of the community, is we assess our organization to determine how can people conduct government business without coming to Chatham. And it led to a good number of investments in what the private sector would call e-commerce, but certainly government commerce, government accessibility, government access through technology. And luckily, we're going to be able to lean into that more because of the extension of the time period to use these funds. I won't belabor this further because everyone did better than I prior and covered the important parts. I will say thank you to the addition of revenue options for the counties of Virginia. It does matter and will matter more. We are one of the counties that was able to successfully be included for the 1% sales tax for school construction. We're going to run that bill or run that referendum this spring, I believe, which will, as you can imagine, being the largest county and being very rural and not having a large population means that per capita, we spend a lot of money to educate our children. We have 21 schools that we maintain in a county of 60,000 people because of our size. And because our school board and our board of supervisors value local schools, community schools, and this 1% sales tax will help us continue to be able to provide neighborhood community schools in our elementary level, which we have 100% accreditation and a fabulous public school system here. And then finally, we do also have some trepidation about the funding of schools as it relates to ADM. There's no telling how many hundreds of thousands of students are lost, not only in Virginia, but across America because of the pandemic. And to judge us financially on those numbers during this unusual time would be very harmful to all of us. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you to all of our panelists. Now I'll open it up with specific questions. Adam, Kimberly, y'all didn't have specific questions, did you, for our panelists? We just want to open it up at this time. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Delegate
Okay.
Aaron
All
has
right.
her hand up. So.
Okay. What kind of questions or comments do we have from our members? Okay, I'm hearing a lot of quiet. Let me I'll make a couple comments while y'all are thinking there.
Aaron, I think was not.
Yep. I think Delegate Aaron is trying to ask a question, but we can't hear her.
Who was that?
Delegate Aird.
Oh, Delegate Aird, how are you doing?
Yeah, but she's having trouble, I think, with her audio.
Oh, okay, okay.
But if she wants to ask her question, maybe in the chat feature, we may be able to read it if we could do that, Adam or Charles.
Sure, yeah, if she can communicate with y'all what her question is, or maybe she can get online there. And
I'll let
Yeah.
April speak. I think she was going to address the chat. I think there was actually, Mr. Chairman, there's an issue with FOIA and the chat function. There was something.
On the
Oh, I'm
on
sorry.
the
Go ahead,
Senate,
April.
I was going to say, Chairman Hanger, on the Senate side, we don't have the chat function turned on related to FOIA, but Delegate Aird went back out and she's trying to come back in. So maybe her audio will be fixed.
Okay.
All right, Delegate Aird, you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I appreciate the
Not hearing you very well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. And I can see you.
Great. I'm sorry about that. I don't know that this is for any particular presenter, but Mr. Chairman, my question is that, you know, the unique nature of this committee is that it allows us to take a deep dive into those localities that are categorized as being in fiscal distress circumstances. And I'm just curious about whether or not the comments made regarding the broad overview and or the specific recommendations of what the state could continue to do are relative to those localities. You know, when I look at the top 20 localities that are in fiscal distress right now, those are cities. And so I'm just curious about, from our panel, whether or not they would say their feedback is relative to those areas that are really in high fiscal stress. And if it's simply transferable the way they recommend the best work that the state could be doing to support those types of communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody want to address that?
Well, I'll take a shot. Neil Morgan here, Miss Aird. I've spent 27 years working for a city, and while I can't speak for some of my city manager friends and colleagues, I'm pretty sure most of them would say the two biggest things in their budgets are supportive schools and public safety. So I would be surprised if most of them didn't agree with most of what you heard today. And in Hampton Roads, we have regional meetings quite frequently during the pandemic, and that includes localities with all kinds of different profiles. And while we have all kinds of unique things going on, the commonality of the challenges is pretty clear to me.
Mm-hmm.
Senator, I can add just very briefly. You know, my comments were formulated mostly by the Virginia Association of Counties, and so these are things that we have surveyed jurisdictions across Virginia, across the spectrum in terms of characteristics as to what, you know, the largest issues they are facing. And, you know, I would certainly agree with Neil. You know, the school funding piece and public safety are huge, regardless of whether you're a city or a county. It is interesting that cities are facing some of the worst fiscal stress, because clearly at the local level, as I emphasized to our delegation repeatedly, flexibility is the key. Giving local governments the flexibility at the local level to be able to decide how they generate revenue and what their priorities are is going to be even more important now in recovering from a pandemic than I would say ever before. And so there is no one size fits all. I think what we're trying to give you is the general challenges that local governments face, recognizing that if you did dig deep into them individually, they might have different characteristics, but I think overarching, the need for flexibility, the need for school funding, especially capital funding, is something we see across the Commonwealth. And of course, the public safety funding, and I braided in with my VACO comments, that extends far beyond, you know, maybe your conventional police or EMS response, but really into our judicial responsibilities as well. And those are increasingly becoming challenging for local governments to be able to afford to keep up with. And so those are things we hear across the Commonwealth, but great question.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, just wanted to piggyback on what Delegate Ayers had asked, the questions she's asking, and even the comments that she's made. And I guess it just in the future, the representation, I think it's also important to have to hear directly from cities in terms of how they are being affected by this. And I think we're all in this together, but it is important to have that representation at the table when these things are being discussed, so that we all are made aware of what's going on. So anyway,
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Right, and I might inject at this time, because it was a good question that was raised. And actually today with our panelists, we were focusing on counties, but our last meeting, which has been some time now, we were still focusing on the first cities. You know, specifically, we'd been working with Petersburg and the situation there and the fiscal stress. But you're right, we need to have another meeting hopefully shortly after session, where we'll focus again, reach back, because not represented here today, of course, even in the counties, are far southwest, where there's a lot of fiscal stress currently. And I certainly would like to follow up with Petersburg and other of our first cities to see how they are managing. I do know, as an example of trying to fix some things, we've struggled with our 599 funding for first cities over the years, and shortchanged at times. During our last budget conference, our special session, Senator Howe and Delegate Torrey and the rest of us decided when we were going to do a bonus for local law enforcement, that we would extend that to the cities for 599 funding. And then that was an issue then of figuring out how to do that. So, you know, it is on the table, and I think we do need to broaden, I guess, our look at what we're doing. Also, while at this point, before anyone else speaks, I'd like to, the issue was raised a couple times. I think Neil might have raised it at one point, and maybe David, about the additional authority we granted for local sales tax, the additional percent for school construction. I actually did not support that. And my reasoning was, I really think that we need to think more broadly, and probably at the state level should be authorizing that 1% statewide, and perhaps flow that money through our funding formulas. And Senator Howe, I'm not suggesting I'm going to put a bill in this session, because I'll get in enough trouble anyway, but I think we need to look at that in terms of, you know, perhaps increasing our sales tax to meet that need more broadly. Because if you look at just doing it locality by locality, the example I would use, if you've got a Walmart in your locality, you can do very well raising that. But if you happen not to have a large retail center in your locality, you're not going to do as well in terms of raising the necessary funds for your locality. So at any rate, that's my 2 cents worth. Other questions, comments?
Mr. Chair. Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Delegate Ware.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on what several of the presenters mentioned, and that has to do with public safety and the range of what's included in public safety. Mr. McKay's comments about the judicial side and mental health and other elements that become part of public safety. Back in the dark ages, I spent 2 terms as a county supervisor in a fairly rural county. Now represent 3 rural counties and part of Chesterfield across the river from Ms. Coates. And I hear more and more frequently about public safety. Would you say is it fair to say that it's intensified and expanded in terms of its fiscal take in the localities? I guess I'm interested in you elaborating a little bit further. Any of you that want to address that?
I'll chime in there, and then I have one answer to the previous question. We border the city of Richmond, and a couple of things specifically related to the CARES Act funding that I think what made administering these funds difficult for cities specifically. There was a lot of money for rental assistance, and I see that in the next couple of bills. But the moratorium on evictions makes that really hard to dole out. So you have localities sitting on a lot of money for eviction diversion, but no one's being evicted. And so we have no way to spend those dollars. And the second one is on the micro grants for small businesses. A lot of those programs were restricted to $5,000 or $10,000 increments. And over the course of a 9 or 12-month pandemic, that's not going to sustain a small business. And so we really need some more flexibility about how much money we can give to those small businesses. And you really see that play out in the city of Richmond, where there's a lot of homegrown local business. In terms of public safety, I absolutely agree with you, Delegate, where that the cost and the breadth of what we consider public safety is expanding. I think generations ago, or even a couple of decades ago, public safety was, black and white, administration of the law, arrest and prosecute. And what we found is that creating an environment that is safe and sustainable and can build a community is much more than that. And so public safety now encompasses social services, and it encompasses mental health, and it encompasses taking care to those who can't care for themselves. Our fire department has evolved into almost a primary care physician type organization, where we have repeat offenders, repeat callers who can't help themselves and have no family members. And so we're sending crisis intervention teams of paramedics and social workers to these people's front doors to help get them in touch with the services they need. And as people historically think about public safety funding, those types of services are not necessarily what come to mind, but they are absolutely what we have playing out on a day-to-day basis.
I would just add one other perspective, and just about everybody's mentioned it. The definition of public safety. Don't forget the ever-growing technology component of the whole public safety world. It's a huge cost. We have a $100 million 911 capital investment that we have to maintain. Records management systems, the requirements for the rest of the system to review body camera video, and then the whole overlay of mental health and social services that the others mentioned. So it's just a lot more than the number of law enforcement individuals, however you look at it.
And Senator, if I could add on, obviously, one of the things we're hearing across Virginia is concerns about new state mandates in these areas too. I think we all want to support reform, but as was just mentioned, the body-worn camera footage review by Commonwealth's attorneys in particular, very pricey. The jail standards, behavioral mental health standards that have been adjusted are concerning. I just seem, I look at our own budget here, and every year the gap between what the state provides for these services and what the county has to supplement gets larger and larger. And of course, in some high cost of living areas, we're already supplementing compensation for many of these functions as well, or else the courts have a real hard time even hiring people. Commonwealth's attorneys, you can't find people who will work for these salaries. And so we also have to supplement the pay as well. Just one quick comment on the school capital needs. What you said, Senator, is exactly what VACO's position is. We support expanding that opportunity, as you just mentioned. And in fact, the debate of our executive board recently was whether we wanted to expand that authority or say more pointedly that we need widespread tax reform in Virginia. And I think there are folks in the counties that are very concerned that if we just expand sales tax opportunities to address school capital, that we will forego a broader conversation about other options that may be out there. And so I would say we support broadening that authority statewide, but more importantly, not in lieu of continued conversation of other opportunities that might be out there.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Other questions or comments? We've just about expended our allotted time, but we'd be glad to entertain additional comments or questions if anyone has them.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted
yes,
the conversation about capital revenues or capital funds to help support, I guess, constructions and possibly even renovation of schools. It's been an interesting discussion, and we, matter of fact, had limited conversation about that today. But I think that is so important, whether it's sales tax or whatever other method that may be made available and supported by the GA, General Assembly. It is so important that we begin to address this particular issue. It is throughout the Commonwealth. Individuals are talking about the limited resources that they have, whether it's being produced by counties or cities, to build schools. And many of these schools have ages 50, 60, 70 years on them. And I think that it has become a priority if we're talking about providing future generations opportunities, whether it's academics or the environment in which they are many times find themselves in, then we're going to have to address this issue. And I think we've been putting it on the back shelf for many years. People don't want to raise taxes. They don't want to do this. And even as recently as last year, we talked about the gaming funds. And there's not much interest in that, but we have to settle down and say, you know what, we're going to influence this issue in a very positive way. And that means sitting down at the table and coming up with a plan that will be beneficial to all of the kids and students of our Commonwealth and these many localities.
Okay. Thank you, Delegate McQuinn. I think you stated it well. I guess, in terms of my bias on this, I still support keeping the capital expenditure as a local government responsibility. But I think where we could assist is creating an additional revenue source from the state to the local governments as they are, so they can be capable of funding those capital needs at the local level. Yeah. Other comments? Okay, Adam, Kimberly, you want to wrap us up, or where we're at?
I think we have concluded our agenda for today.
Okay. And what I would say is that for the members and for our guest panelists, particularly, we need more input. I would like for us to plan for an additional meeting after the session, and for us to have ideas to put on the table so that we might be in a position to adopt a more aggressive agenda for the 2022 session of the General Assembly. I think this session is going to be, well, it's going to be tough. And so we're not going to do too much heavy lifting that we intend to. We might have to do some just because we have to. But I would like for us, if y'all concur, to see if we can't adopt a fairly aggressive agenda over this next year, up to and including if we need to dig back into broader tax reform, looking at all the indexes and the formulas that we use to fund local government, and more broadly at the disparities that are out there and the causes of those disparities. I would be all for that. And so I look forward to those conversations. But if Adam, Kimberly, if you all can kind of be the focal point to receive that information, and we'll see what we can do then later this year.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and members can send ideas our way, and we'll work on getting together and aggressive.
Okay, great. That sounds good. That sounds good. Okay, if there's no further business to come before this commission, we will adjourn. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.